A royal scandal once shook the court. But the woman everyone expected to collapse was the one quietly controlling the outcome. At first, the palace whispered about betrayal, passion, and a rival who seemed impossible to remove. Yet behind the silence of the great hall, something far more calculated began to unfold. A wife who never shouted, never accused, and never fought in public, slowly rearranged the entire court around her. Courtiers thought they were watching a love affair fade, but they were actually witnessing a strategy years in the making. Tonight, we step into the quiet corridors of power to discover how a wife restored order, to erased a scandal, and turned patience into the strongest weapon in the palace. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment, letting me know what time it is, where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one listened carefully in the long corridors of a Tudor palace after the excitement of an affair had begun to fade, the silence itself would reveal more than the whispers that once filled the air. At the height of a scandal, every glance carried meaning, and every conversation seemed to hide a secret. Courtiers leaned toward one another. Servants moved through doorways with knowing expressions, and the great hall buzzed with speculation. For a time, passion appeared to dominate the entire court, but courts were never truly governed by passion. In reality, passion was only a brief disturbance in a system that depended on stability. Tudor power rested on lineage, property, alliance, and reputation. These structures had been built carefully over generations. A single romance, however dramatic, could not replace them. It could only disrupt them for a short while. The excitement surrounding an affair usually burned brightly at first. The mistress might receive attention from every corner of the palace. Her presence at feasts drew curious glances. Her clothing and jewels became subjects of quiet discussion. Even those who disapproved could not avoid watching the unfolding drama. Yet fascination rarely lasted long in places ruled by calculation. Eventually, the man at the center of the affair began to notice something uncomfortable. The admiration that once surrounded him slowly changed in tone. What had felt flattering at first started to resemble scrutiny. The whispers of courtiers no longer sounded amused. They sounded cautious. Reputation had entered the conversation. For a king or powerful nobleman, reputation was not merely personal pride. It was a form of political currency. Foreign ambassadors judged the strength of a household through its discipline. Rival families measured opportunities through signs of disorder. Even minor rumors could weaken alliances that had taken decades to secure. This realization often arrived quietly. The laughter surrounding the affair became less enthusiastic. Invitations grew more formal. Conversations began returning to matters of land, taxation, diplomacy, and inheritance. The court was reminding itself what truly mattered. Passion had entertained the court. Politics sustained it. For the man involved in the affair, this shift could feel exhausting. What once seemed thrilling now threatened to damage the dignity of his household. Every public appearance risked provoking new gossip. Every absence beside his wife encouraged further speculation. Gradually, he began to grow tired of the noise. Not because affection had completely vanished, but because the consequences had become inconvenient. Scandal might amuse the court briefly, yet it also created instability. Instability made allies nervous and enemies bold. In Tudor society, instability was never tolerated for long. At this stage, something subtle began to change within the household. Attention moved away from the mistress and back toward the structure of the family itself. The court wanted reassurance that the order still existed, and that reassurance usually appeared in a familiar form. The wife, unlike the mistress, her authority did not depend on novelty. Her position rested on recognition granted by law, church, and lineage. She represented continuity, legitimacy, and the future of the family line. For weeks or months, she might have remained quiet while the affair dominated conversation. Many observers mistook this quietness for weakness. Yet silence in a court could be a powerful form of patience. While others reacted, she watched. She observed how quickly excitement faded. She noticed when the whispers changed tone. She recognized the moment when the court began to worry about reputation instead of romance. That moment mattered more than the affair itself. Because once reputation became the priority, the entire situation changed. The court no longer cared about the thrill of scandal. It cared about restoring dignity. A noble household could survive many things, but it could not survive appearing foolish in front of its rivals. The man involved began to understand this pressure clearly. His household represented more than his personal desires. It symbolized alliances, inheritance, and authority. When rumors threatened that image, they had to be controlled. Slowly, the atmosphere of the palace shifted. Public appearances with the wife became more frequent. Religious observances were emphasized again. Formal ceremonies returned to the center of court life. These gestures reassured observers that stability had not been lost. None of this required a dramatic confrontation. There were no loud accusations, no declarations of guilt, no theatrical scenes in the Great Hall. Instead, the court simply redirected its attention. In a place where attention determined influence, that redirection carried enormous meaning. The mistress, who had once drawn every gaze, suddenly seemed less central. The wife, whose presence had always represented legitimacy, gradually stood at the center of public life once more. The court understood what was happening, even if no one spoke about it openly. Passion had been entertaining. Reputation was essential. And when the two collided, reputation always won. This quiet transition marked the true beginning of the struggle. The affair itself was fading, but the damage it had created still lingered in whispers and memory. Someone would have to restore the dignity of the household before those whispers hardened into a lasting scandal. In Tudor courts, such restoration rarely came from dramatic gestures. It came from patience. It came from restraint. And very often, it came from the woman who had been silent the entire time. The affair had lost its excitement, and the court had begun turning its attention back toward reputation and order. Yet restoring dignity required more than silence, because the household itself needed a visible anchor of legitimacy. What many observers had not yet realized was that the quiet woman beside the throne held exactly that power. The legal wife occupied a position that the excitement of an affair could not easily erase. In Tudor society, marriage was not treated as a private bond, formed only by affection. It was a formal structure, recognized by law and reinforced by religion. When a marriage took place, it created obligations not only between two individuals, but between entire families. Land, alliance, inheritance, and reputation were all connected to that union. Because of this, the wife represented far more than a personal relationship. She represented legitimacy. The church confirmed the marriage through sacred ritual, declaring it binding before God. The law recorded it as a contract that protected property, inheritance, and family alliances. Together, these two institutions gave the wife a stability that did not depend on charm or novelty. Even when gossip filled the palace corridors, those foundations remained intact. For the court, this distinction was important. A mistress could capture attention. A wife anchored the household. Courtiers might whisper about the latest scandal or speculate about the king's private affections. Yet they also understood the deeper structure beneath the drama. Titles passed through legitimate bloodlines. Estates remained tied to recognized marriages. Political alliances depended on the stability of family connections. The wife stood at the center of that structure. Her authority extended most clearly through her children. In Tudor society, the birth of legitimate heirs determined the future of power and property. A son born within marriage carried rights that no child born outside it could easily claim. Through these children, the wife ensured the continuation of the family name and the preservation of its wealth. This role gave her quiet influence within the household. She supervised the upbringing of heirs, oversaw tutors and servants, and shaped the environment in which future nobles would grow. In doing so, she influenced the next generation of political alliances, marriage negotiations, inheritance arrangements, and family diplomacy. All revolved around the legitimacy of those children. The mistress could never replace this position. Her presence might attract fascination, but it could not create lawful inheritance. Even if she received gifts or attention, those privileges depended entirely on the temporary favor of one man. The wife's authority, by contrast, rested on institutions far older and more stable than individual affection. The court recognized this difference even when it pretended not to. During official ceremonies, the wife appeared beside her husband in positions that symbolized dignity and continuity. At religious observances, she represented the moral order of the household. During diplomatic visits, her presence reassured foreign envoys that the family structure remained legitimate and stable. These appearances carried meaning. A noble household was expected to project order to the outside world. Disorder suggested weakness. Weaknesses encouraged rivals to challenge alliances or question authority. By maintaining the visible structure of marriage, the wife protected the reputation of the family itself. She also embodied the alliances that had created the marriage in the first place. Most noble marriages were arranged through careful negotiation between families. Land might be combined, political loyalties strengthened, or rival houses reconciled through the union. The wife, therefore, represented not only her husband's household, but also the powerful relatives who stood behind her. This network of alliances gave her position additional weight. If she were treated poorly or publicly humiliated, the insult extended beyond her personally. It touched the honor of her entire family. Because of this, even powerful husbands had to consider the political consequences of undermining their wives too openly. Such realities created a delicate balance within the court. While a mistress might draw fascination and excitement, the wife represented the stability that allowed the household to function. Servants took their orders from the structures she maintained. Relatives respected the alliances she embodied. Diplomats judged the strength of the household, partly through her visible authority. In quiet ways, her presence organized the rhythm of court life. She presided over ceremonies. She supervised the domestic hierarchy. She upheld the image of discipline that noble families depended upon. These responsibilities rarely produced dramatic stories, but they formed the foundation of power. Without them, the household would appear chaotic, and chaos was something Tudor society feared deeply. For this reason, the wife's position often became more important as scandals faded. When passion lost its novelty, the court began to focus again on stability. In that moment, the legal wife stood not as a rival to the mistress, but as the visible symbol of order returning. Her authority had never disappeared. It had simply been overshadowed by excitement. Now, as the whispers of romance slowly lost their energy, the court began to recognize again what had always been true. Legitimacy did not belong to passion. It belonged to the woman whose marriage had been written into law, blessed by the church, and tied to the future of the family itself. The court might whisper about romance, but the structure of power still rested on legitimacy. As attention slowly returned to stability, the legal wife stood quietly at the center of the household once again. Yet the court had not forgotten the scandal entirely, and the lingering rumors would begin to spread in ways that were far more dangerous than open gossip. Rumors rarely moved loudly through a royal court. They traveled more quietly than that, slipping through stone corridors and lingering in corners where conversations softened into whispers. Long after the excitement of an affair faded, its echo often remained behind in the form of speculation. In Tudor palaces, these whispers could spread faster than official announcements. The great halls were large, but the court itself was small. Servants carried trays between chambers. Scribes moved from office to office, and courtiers lingered near doorways where private conversations were never quite as private as intended. Words passed from one person to another with remarkable speed, each retelling, adjusting the tone slightly, until the original story barely resembled the version now circulating. An affair, once exposed to this network of whispers, rarely disappeared completely. Even when the romance itself lost its intensity, the memory of it continued to circulate. A glance across a banquet table could provoke a quiet comment. A delayed appearance at a ceremony might invite speculation. In a society deeply concerned with honor and reputation, these small observations accumulated into something larger. The court watched everything. Officials who served the crown observed the household, not only out of curiosity but also out of duty. Stability within the royal family reflected stability within the kingdom itself. If the king appeared distracted by scandal, it raised questions about judgment. If noble households appeared divided, it suggested weakness within the structure of authority. Such concerns rarely appeared in open conversation. Instead, they emerged through subtle reactions. Courtiers measured the tone of the king's interactions with his wife. They noticed whether the mistress still appeared at gatherings. They watched how servants behaved around both women, looking for clues about the shifting balance of favor inside the household. These observations soon extended beyond the palace walls. Foreign ambassadors stationed at court paid close attention to domestic tensions. Their reports traveled across Europe, carried in sealed letters, describing not only treaties and negotiations, but also the private behavior of the royal household. Diplomacy depended heavily on perception. A ruler who appeared controlled and disciplined inspired confidence among allies. A ruler surrounded by scandal invited doubt. If an affair seemed to disrupt the royal family, ambassadors might quietly question the stability of the king's judgment. Rival nations sometimes interpreted domestic gossip as a sign of political vulnerability. Even minor stories could influence how foreign courts assessed the strength of alliances. Because of this, reputation carried international consequences. The whispers that drifted through palace corridors could eventually influence negotiations far beyond the kingdom. A careless rumor might weaken the perception of royal authority, encouraging rivals to test the boundaries of diplomacy or challenge agreements that once seemed secure. The connection between scandal and politics was therefore much stronger than it appeared. To ordinary observers, an affair looked like a personal matter. To diplomats and nobles, it suggested something more serious. If a king allowed scandal to dominate his household, some wondered whether he might also allow disorder to spread into matters of governance. These doubts did not need to be spoken openly. Their presence alone could damage trust. Within the court itself, the atmosphere slowly changed as these concerns grew. Conversations became more cautious. Courtiers avoided repeating certain stories in public spaces, though they continued sharing them in private chambers. The affair, once discussed with excitement, now carried a faint tone of unease. Everyone understood that reputation was fragile. A noble family might spend decades constructing an image of honor and discipline. Yet a single scandal, repeated often enough in whispers, could gradually erode that image. Each retelling added another layer of doubt. The process was slow but persistent. One whisper became two. Two whispers became speculation. Speculation became quiet suspicion. And suspicion, once established, rarely disappeared easily. For the royal household, this atmosphere created pressure that could not be ignored. The affair itself might have faded emotionally, but its consequences continued to circulate through rumor and observation. Every gesture made by the king or his family now carried additional meaning. In such circumstances, Restoring reputation required careful management. Silence alone could not erase what had already been noticed. The court needed visible reassurance that order remained intact. Diplomats needed to see stability rather than scandal. Noble families needed confirmation that the alliances connecting them to the crown remained secure. Until that reassurance appeared, the whispers continued. They moved through stone hallways and candlelit chambers, shaping perceptions long before any official decision was announced. By the time the court realized how far the rumors had traveled, they had already begun influencing how others judged the household. The affair might have ended, but its shadow lingered in every quiet conversation. The affair had already faded, but the whispers it created continued drifting through the stone corridors of the court. Nobles and officials quietly watched the royal household, measuring every gesture for signs of stability or weakness. What none of them yet realized was that the real danger would begin only after the passion itself had disappeared. The moment when passion fades is often mistaken for the moment when danger ends. In reality, the fading of passion frequently marks the beginning of a more delicate stage in court life. During the height of an affair, everything is visible. The glances, the gossip, the excitement of scandal, all of it fills the halls with noise. Yet once the excitement begins to disappear, something far more complicated takes its place. Silence. At first, the change seems almost peaceful. The man who once appeared captivated now moves through the court with greater restraint. Conversations return to matters of state. Banquets proceed without the charged tension that once surrounded every entrance of the mistress. Courtiers, sensing the shift, begin to speak less openly about the scandal. But beneath this calm surface, the consequences remain. The affair may have lost its intensity, yet the memory of it lingers within the court. Servants remember what they witnessed in private corridors. Courtiers remember the whispers exchanged behind tapestries and pillars. Diplomats remember the letters they sent describing the unusual atmosphere of the royal household. Memory moves slowly through a court, but it rarely disappears. For the man at the center of the scandal, this stage often brings a different kind of discomfort. What once felt thrilling now appears inconvenient. The fascination of the affair has vanished, leaving behind only the complications it created. Every public appearance invites quiet observation. Every gesture toward his wife becomes a signal that courtiers interpret carefully. Gradually, he begins to withdraw from the drama that once surrounded him. The gifts become less frequent. Private meetings become shorter. The attention that once filled his days returns to matters of governance. To many observers, this shift suggests that the story is ending. In truth, the story is only changing direction, because the court itself has not forgotten. Rumors do not vanish simply because the man involved has lost interest. They continue to circulate among courtiers who measure power through reputation. Each whisper carries the possibility of shaping how others interpret the stability of the household. Foreign envoys remain particularly attentive during this period. Their duty requires them to observe not only treaties and negotiations, but also the private atmosphere surrounding the ruler. A court that appears divided can signal weakness to rival nations. Even small domestic scandals may influence diplomatic calculations far beyond the palace walls. For this reason, the consequences of an affair rarely remain personal. They become political. If the situation remains unresolved, the whispers surrounding the scandal may begin to shape how the court itself behaves. Courtiers might hesitate before aligning themselves too closely with the royal household. Rival factions may interpret the situation as an opportunity to gain influence. The uncertainty spreads quietly, and uncertainty, within a court, is rarely tolerated. This is why the period after passion fades can be the most dangerous moment of all. During the affair itself, the situation is obvious. Everyone understands that emotions are driving events. But once those emotions fade, the court begins searching for signs of stability. If stability does not appear, suspicion grows. Within this delicate moment stands the wife, She has watched the entire sequence unfold. She has observed the rise of fascination, the spread of gossip, and the slow decline of the affair itself. Unlike many others in the court, she understands that the fading of passion does not resolve the problem. It merely reveals the damage. Reputation has been weakened. Whispers have travelled beyond the palace. Observers now wait to see how the household will respond. If nothing happens, the story may continue to grow in the imagination of the court. Silence without action can easily be mistaken for weakness. A noble household that appears unable to restore its dignity risks losing authority among both allies and rivals. The wife recognizes this danger clearly. She does not need to confront the mistress publicly. Such drama would only revive the scandal. Instead, she must act with patience and precision, guiding the household back towards stability without giving the court another spectacle to watch. In Tudor society, reputation could rarely be repaired through loud declarations. It required something quieter, a careful adjustment of appearances, a subtle reshaping of relationships, a gradual restoration of order within the household. These changes must happen slowly enough to appear natural, yet deliberately enough to correct the damage left behind by the affair. Only then will the court begin to forget. Only then will the whispers fade, and only then will the household regain the authority that scandal briefly disrupted. The wife understands that this moment cannot be ignored. While others believe the story is ending, she knows that the most important decisions must be made now. Because if she does not act first, the court itself may decide the outcome. The passion that once fascinated the court has already faded into memory. Yet the consequences of that fascination still linger quietly within every corridor of the palace. Few within the court understand that the silent wife has already begun preparing the steps that will restore the balance of power. In a Tudor court, reputation functioned almost like a second form of currency. Land and titles might determine legal authority, but reputation determined how others chose to respond to that authority. A noble household with a strong reputation inspired loyalty, cooperation, and respect. A household surrounded by scandal, however, invited hesitation and quiet doubt. Because of this, reputation could not be treated as a simple matter of personal pride. It was a political necessity. For the wife observing the aftermath of an affair, this truth was unmistakable. Her own emotions, whether anger, humiliation, or grief, could not be allowed to guide her actions openly. A dramatic confrontation might satisfy personal feelings, yet it would also feed the very scandal that threatened the family's standing. In a court society, emotional reactions often created larger problems. A public argument between husband and wife would quickly become the center of conversation throughout the palace. Servants would repeat the story, courtiers would exaggerate its details, and diplomats might even include it in their reports to foreign courts. What began as a private grievance could easily transform into a political embarrassment. The wife, therefore, faced a difficult choice. She could respond emotionally and risk strengthening the scandal, or she could manage the situation carefully and restore the household's dignity. In most cases, survival within the court required the second path. Reputation demanded restraint. Instead of seeking revenge or dramatic justice, the wife had to think like a strategist. Every action taken within the palace carried symbolic meaning. Every appearance in public communicated something about the stability of the household. If she appeared furious, observers might assume the marriage was collapsing. If she appeared calm, the court would gradually interpret the situation differently. This was why reputation management often relied on subtle gestures rather than loud declarations. The wife might begin by increasing her presence in formal ceremonies. She might attend religious services more frequently, reinforcing the image of moral order within the household. Such actions did not erase the affair, but they reshaped the narrative surrounding it. Gradually, the court would begin speaking less about scandal and more about stability. The wife's dignity would replace the mistress's novelty as the dominant image in the palace. Reputation, once threatened, could slowly rebuild itself through these repeated displays of discipline. Equally important was the avoidance of public conflict. A confrontation with the mistress might satisfy the curiosity of the court, but it would also extend the life of the scandal. Every raised voice, every accusation, and every visible expression of jealousy would create new material for gossip. Silence, by contrast, offered far fewer opportunities for rumour. When the wife refused to provide dramatic scenes, the court eventually lost interest in the emotional side of the story. Without spectacle, scandal struggled to survive. Conversations shifted naturally toward other matters that seemed more interesting or more politically significant. This quiet strategy required patience. The wife could not remove the consequences of the affair immediately. Reputation recovered slowly, through consistent behavior rather than sudden action. Each public appearance reinforced the message that the household remained orderly and disciplined. Meanwhile, smaller adjustments could begin taking place behind the scenes. Servants might alter their routines. Invitations might be extended differently. The mistress might notice subtle changes in how she was received within the palace. None of these changes needed to be explained openly. Their meaning would become clear over time. The goal of this strategy was simple but delicate. The household needed to regain its dignity without creating a new spectacle. The mistress could not be publicly destroyed, because such drama would only revive the scandal. Instead, the situation had to be quietly corrected. The court would eventually notice that the mistress appeared less often. Conversations about the affair would grow shorter. The wife's authority within the household would become more visible again. When this process worked successfully, observers often believed that the scandal had simply faded away. In reality, it had been carefully managed. Reputation in Tudor society was rarely repaired through force. It was repaired through discipline, patience, and the careful control of appearances. The wife understood this instinctively, because her position depended on maintaining the image of stability that the court expected to see. She did not need to erase the past. She only needed to guide the court toward forgetting it. The court believed the scandal was fading naturally as attention slowly returned to order and ceremony. In truth, that calm surface was being carefully shaped by deliberate choices about reputation and appearance. The next stage of this quiet strategy would depend on recognizing the subtle signals that revealed how the husband's attitude had already begun to change. In the quiet rhythm of a noble household, changes in affection rarely arrived with announcements. No servant rang a bell to declare that passion had faded, and no court official recorded the moment when fascination quietly dissolved into indifference. Instead, the shift revealed itself through a series of small signals that attentive observers could easily notice. For the wife, these signals mattered greatly. An affair did not truly begin to end when the court stopped whispering about it. It began to end when the man at the center of the scandal started behaving differently. His habits, his gestures, and his attention toward the mistress slowly changed in ways that could not easily be hidden. The first sign often appeared in the most private place within the household: distance. The man who once seemed eager to escape into private chambers began to linger elsewhere. Meetings with advisors lasted longer, time spent discussing matters of land, finance, and diplomacy quietly replaced evenings once devoted to personal indulgence. The mistress might still exist within the palace, but the sense of urgency that once surrounded her presence had weakened. Servants noticed this change long before anyone spoke of it openly. Servants always understood the rhythms of their masters' lives. They observed which rooms were visited frequently and which corridors grew quiet, when private doors that once opened each night began to remain closed. The meaning was difficult to miss. For the wife, such signals carried important information. They suggested that the emotional power of the affair had begun to decline. Passion, which once overshadowed reason, no longer controlled the daily routine of the household. The man involved might not openly admit this change, yet his actions revealed it clearly enough. Another sign appeared through the movement of gifts. During the height of fascination, gifts often flowed generously toward the mistress. Jewelry, clothing, and other luxuries served as visible symbols of favor. Courtiers noticed these gifts, and the court itself interpreted them as confirmation of the mistress's influence. But when interest faded, the gifts became less frequent. A necklace promised weeks earlier might never arrive. Fabrics once ordered eagerly might remain untouched in storage. The mistress might still receive occasional gestures, yet they lacked the excitement that once accompanied them. Such changes rarely required explanation. Everyone within the palace understood what they meant. The mistress herself often sensed the transformation through the gradual loss of attention. Invitations to private meetings became less certain. Conversations that once felt intimate began to feel brief and distracted. The atmosphere surrounding the relationship shifted from fascination to routine. Routine was rarely a good sign for passion. Private meetings provided another clear signal. During the height of an affair, secrecy created excitement. The effort required to arrange hidden encounters often intensified the sense of intimacy. Servants carried messages quietly. Corridors were chosen carefully, and doors closed behind whispered conversations. When the affair began to weaken, these meetings became rare. The man no longer felt the same urgency to seek them. Days passed without the private encounters that once seemed essential. Weeks might pass without the elaborate arrangements that had once been necessary to conceal the relationship. In the silence left behind, the mistress could feel the change, even if no one acknowledged it directly. For the wife, recognizing these signals required patience and careful observation. Acting too early could revive the scandal and strengthen the mistress's position. Acting too late could allow rumors to grow stronger within the court. Timing mattered. She watched how often her husband appeared beside her in public. She noticed whether his tone toward the mistress had become distant or indifferent. Each subtle change suggested that the balance of influence within the household was shifting. The court noticed these changes as well. Courtiers rarely spoke openly about such matters, yet they observed everything. When the husband's attention turned away from the mistress, the court began adjusting its behavior accordingly. Servants grew less eager to assist the mistress. Invitations from noble households became less frequent. Influence in a court was never permanent. It depended entirely on attention. Once, attention moved elsewhere. Influence faded quickly. The wife understood this process better than most. She knew that the decline of passion created an opportunity. If she acted with patience and precision, the mistress could gradually lose her position without a single public confrontation. The court would interpret the change as natural. The affair would seem to fade on its own. Yet behind this quiet transformation stood careful observation and deliberate restraint. The wife had waited for the moment when fascination turned into distance. Only then could the household begin restoring its reputation without creating another scandal. The signs of fading passion had begun appearing quietly in the routines of the household. Distance replaced excitement, and the gifts and meetings that once symbolized influence slowly disappeared. In that quiet transformation, the wife could finally see the moment when the center of power was beginning to shift again. Removing a mistress from the center of court life rarely happened through a single dramatic decision. Tudor courts preferred quieter methods. Methods that did not create the spectacle of punishment or humiliation. A public confrontation would only revive gossip and renew the fascination that the court had already begun to lose interest in. Instead, influence faded gradually. In royal households, attention determined power. Whoever appeared most often beside the ruler seemed important, and whoever disappeared from view slowly lost authority. Because of this, the simplest way to weaken the mistress's position was not through accusation, but through absence. The first change often appeared at public gatherings. Feasts and banquets had always been important stages for court life. Nobles observed one another across long tables lit by candlelight. Seating arrangements, gestures of attention, and moments of conversation all carried political meaning. During the height of an affair, the mistress might have been placed close enough to attract notice. Courtiers would watch how often the king spoke to her, how often he smiled, how often servants carried gifts in her direction. But when the court began restoring order, these arrangements changed. The mistress might still attend the feast, but she would sit farther away from the center of attention. Conversations that once included her would pass quietly around her instead. Servants might approach other guests more frequently, leaving her table strangely calm. Nothing about these changes appeared openly hostile. Yet the message was unmistakable. The mistress was no longer central to the life of the court. Over time, invitations themselves might become less certain. Some ceremonies might take place without her presence. Religious observances, family gatherings, and diplomatic receptions would emphasize the visibility of the legal wife and legitimate household instead. The court noticed these patterns quickly. Courtiers understood that visibility within the palace represented influence. When a figure appeared less frequently in important settings, it suggested that her authority was quietly diminishing. Even without spoken explanations, the court began adjusting its behavior accordingly. Servants played an important role in this transformation. During the height of the affair, certain servants might have been assigned specifically to assist the mistress. They carried messages, arranged meetings, and ensured that her presence in the palace remained comfortable. Their loyalty often reflected the favor she enjoyed from the ruler. But once that favor weakened, these arrangements could change. Servants might be reassigned to other duties within the household. A maid who once attended the mistress closely might suddenly find herself assisting another noblewoman. A steward who once delivered gifts might now carry instructions for entirely different matters. These changes rarely required explanation. In a palace governed by hierarchy, reassignment could always be described as a simple administrative decision. Yet everyone within the household understood the deeper meaning behind such adjustments. Without her familiar attendance, the mistress's position began to feel uncertain. The quiet movement of servants altered the daily rhythm of her life. Messages arrived less quickly. Invitations became more formal. The easy access she once enjoyed to private rooms or privileged spaces within the palace gradually narrowed. This process created distance without spectacle, and distance weakened influence. The wife understood that such changes had to appear natural. If the court sensed deliberate punishment, sympathy might shift toward the mistress. Instead, the adjustments needed to feel like part of the palace's normal routine. A feast arranged differently, a servant assigned elsewhere, a ceremony was held without her presence. Individually, each action seemed insignificant. Together, they slowly removed the mistress from the center of attention. The court, which once observed her with curiosity, gradually found fewer reasons to speak about her at all. Without frequent appearances, fascination faded quickly. New conversations replaced the old gossip. In Tudor courts, memory was often guided by visibility. When a figure disappeared from the places where power gathered, her influence diminished almost immediately. The mistress did not need to be condemned publicly. The court simply stopped looking at her. This quiet withdrawal protected the dignity of the household. No scandal was revived. No confrontation disrupted the careful image of stability that the court wished to restore. Yet the effect was unmistakable. The center of power had shifted again. The legal wife stood once more at the visible heart of the household, while the mistress drifted gradually toward the edges of court life. Few people spoke openly about the change, but everyone could see it unfolding through the smallest details of daily routine. In Tudor society, power rarely vanished overnight. It faded through absence. The mistress had not been publicly condemned, yet her presence at the center of the court was slowly disappearing. Banquets, ceremonies, and servants quietly rearranged the patterns of attention within the palace. Soon, the court would begin noticing that her absence felt almost natural, as though she had never truly belonged there at all. In many stories about royal courts, conflict appears loud and dramatic. People imagine accusations shouted across banquet tables or rivals confronting one another in front of watching courtiers. Yet the true mechanics of power in a Tudor palace were rarely so theatrical. The most effective victories often arrived without noise at all. Within the palace, silence could accomplish what confrontation never could. The wife understood this clearly. A public dispute with the mistress would only revive the fascination that the court had already begun to lose. It would create a spectacle. And spectacles were exactly what gossip needed to survive. So instead of confrontation, something quieter began to unfold. At first, the change seemed almost too small to notice. The mistress continued moving through the palace as she always had. She still occupied her chambers, still passed through corridors that had once welcomed her presence, still spoke politely to courtiers who had grown accustomed to seeing her near the center of royal attention. But the atmosphere around her was beginning to shift. During feasts, conversations did not linger as long in her direction. The courtiers who once leaned toward her with curiosity now spoke more cautiously. Their attention drifted toward other figures within the hall, especially toward the legal wife, whose presence had quietly returned to prominence. No one explained the change. In the early days of the affair, every movement involving the mistress had drawn curiosity. Servants hurried to assist her. Musicians watched for signs of approval. Even minor nobles tried to secure a moment of conversation, hoping to benefit from her influence. Now that attention softened, a servant might pass her chair before noticing that she required assistance. A courtier who once greeted her eagerly might offer only a polite nod before continuing toward another conversation. None of these gestures appeared hostile, yet together they created a subtle distance. The mistress remained physically present, but socially, she was already drifting toward the edges of court life. This was how power quietly withdrew in Tudor society. No decree announced the end of influence. No official ceremony marked the moment when favor disappeared. Instead, influence faded through the absence of attention. The palace simply stopped revolving around her. Invitations to certain gatherings became uncertain. A dinner might be arranged without sending word to her chambers. A religious observance might proceed without her presence among the guests. Courtiers noticed the pattern, though they rarely spoke about it directly. Each omission seemed small. Together, they formed a pattern that no one could ignore. Even the servants sensed the transformation. The attendants who once hurried to anticipate her needs had been reassigned to other duties. Without their quiet assistance, daily routines became more complicated. Messages arrived later. Arrangements required greater effort. The palace had not expelled her, yet it no longer revolved around her either. The wife, meanwhile, did not need to make dramatic gestures. Her influence worked through structure rather than confrontation. By restoring the normal rhythm of the household, she allowed the court to rediscover its previous hierarchy. The mistress did not need to be defeated. She simply needed to fade. In courts governed by reputation, attention determined reality. When the court ceased to speak about someone, their influence gradually dissolved. Without conversation, gossip had nothing to sustain itself. And so the mistress's disappearance unfolded slowly. A seat was left empty at one banquet, a missed invitation the following week. A corridor crossed, without attracting the usual glances. None of these moments felt dramatic. Yet, each one removed another thread from the network of attention that once supported her presence in the palace. Over time, even the courtiers who had once watched the affair with fascination began speaking of other matters entirely. Diplomacy, inheritance, and alliances reclaimed the center of conversation. The mistress's name appeared less frequently in whispers, then rarely at all. In Tudor courts, the most effective removal rarely required force. The palace simply turned its attention elsewhere. Without attention, influence could not survive. The mistress had not been accused, punished, or publicly disgraced. She had simply become invisible. No accusations had echoed through the halls, and no confrontation had entertained the court. Instead, the mistress's presence faded quietly as attention drifted away from her. In that quiet disappearance, the court began to realize that a different network of influence had already begun guiding events behind the palace walls. Royal courts were sustained not only by kings and ministers, but also by quiet alliances among women of rank. Noble women formed circles of influence that stretched across households, marriages, and generations. These connections rarely appeared in official records, yet they shaped the rhythm of court life in ways that were impossible to ignore. The legal wife understood this network very well. Marriage had already linked her to powerful families. Mothers, sisters, cousins, and in-laws all belonged to a shared web of obligation and loyalty. Each of these women managed her own household, hosted gatherings, and guided the social expectations that governed noble society. Together, they created something stronger than individual authority. They created a social structure. Within that structure, reputation traveled quickly. If a noblewoman faced humiliation, her relatives felt the insult as their own. Honor in aristocratic families was rarely personal. It belonged to the entire lineage. Protecting that honor, therefore, became a collective responsibility. Because of this, the wife did not stand alone after the scandal. Her mother-in-law might begin visiting the palace more frequently, appearing beside her during ceremonies or family gatherings. A sister might remain close during banquets, speaking with her in full view of the court. Cousins from allied households might arrive at court unexpectedly, bringing with them the quiet reminder that the wife belonged to a powerful network of families. None of these gestures required explanation, but everyone understood their meaning. Courtiers watched carefully how noble families supported one another. When several respected women appeared beside the wife in public settings, the message was unmistakable. Her position remained secure, and the families behind her were prepared to defend that stability. Such displays rarely involved confrontation. Instead, they reinforced legitimacy. At the same time, the network of noble women began reshaping the social life of the court. Women of rank often organized private gatherings, small dinners, and celebrations that allowed noble families to maintain alliances outside the formal ceremonies of the palace. These gatherings were more influential than they appeared. Diplomatic conversations sometimes began over shared meals. Marriage negotiations were quietly discussed between mothers and aunts long before they reached the ears of men. Social acceptance often depended on these intimate spaces where reputation was quietly evaluated. When the mistress first appeared within the court, curiosity might have secured her invitations to such gatherings. Some noble women welcomed her politely, observing her behavior and measuring the strength of her influence. But as the wife's network quietly strengthened, the atmosphere began to change. A dinner might be arranged without informing the mistress. A small gathering might occur in another wing of the palace. An afternoon conversation might end before she arrived. None of these actions appeared hostile, yet they created distance. Social distance within a court carried powerful meaning. Influence required visibility within the circles where conversation flowed most freely. Without invitations to those gatherings, the mistress gradually lost access to the informal alliances that sustained her reputation. Over time, the pattern became clearer. Noble women who once greeted the mistress warmly now responded with polite restraint. Their conversations turned toward other matters. Their attention shifted back toward the legal wife, whose presence represented continuity and stability. Isolation rarely appeared sudden. It unfolded quietly. A missed invitation one week, a conversation that ended too quickly. The next, a gathering where her presence no longer seemed necessary. The mistress remained within the palace, but the social structure surrounding her began to dissolve. Without the quiet support of noble women, her influence weakened far more quickly than she expected. The court noticed these changes. Courtiers who once pursued her attention now looked elsewhere. Servants sensed the shifting priorities of their masters and adjusted their behavior accordingly. Even visiting diplomats observed the pattern, interpreting it as evidence that the household had begun restoring its internal order. The wife did not need to command this transformation openly. Her network of relatives and allies understood their roles instinctively. Each woman adjusted her behavior in small ways that collectively reshaped the atmosphere of the court. Gradually, the center of social life returned to its former structure. The wife stood once again at the heart of noble gatherings. Conversations flowed around her presence. Alliances that had briefly drifted toward the mistress quietly returned to the stability of the legitimate household. The mistress had not been publicly condemned, yet the palace no longer revolved around her. In Tudor society, power often moved through invisible channels rather than official proclamations. The network of noblewomen acted as one of those channels, guiding attention back toward the household that represented legitimacy. Through patience and cooperation, they allowed the court to forget the fascination that once surrounded the affair. And when the court forgets, influence disappears. The mistress had not been openly rejected, yet the social circles of the court had quietly closed around the legal wife once again. Conversations, invitations, and alliances now gathered within the network that supported her authority. Within that restored order, the court would soon witness a more visible effort to repair the public image of the royal household. Public reputation rarely repairs itself. In royal courts, silence could stop rumors for a time, but stability had to be displayed before witnesses. The wife understood that restoring order within the household was only the first step. The court itself had to see that the order was returned. Visibility became the next strategy. For weeks, the palace might have spoken quietly about the fading scandal. Courtiers noticed the mistress appearing less often. Noblewomen had already adjusted their invitations. Conversations in the corridors no longer revolved around passion and intrigue. Yet whispers never disappeared entirely. They simply waited for confirmation. That confirmation often arrived through a public ceremony. Royal courts depended heavily on spectacle. Feasts, religious observances, diplomatic receptions, and seasonal celebrations all created moments where the household of the ruler appeared before nobles, officials, and foreign envoys. These events allowed the court to measure the health of royal authority. The wife knew that absence during such moments would only invite further speculation. Therefore, she returned to visibility. At the next major gathering, she appeared beside her husband with the calm confidence expected of her position. The entrance into the great hall was carefully observed by everyone present. Courtiers paused their conversations, quietly studying the distance between husband and wife, the tone of their gestures, the expression on their faces. Small details mattered. If the husband offered his arm as they walked into the hall, observers immediately noticed. If the wife spoke to him with ease during the banquet, it suggested reconciliation. Even the placement of seats at the table carried meaning. A seat beside the husband confirmed her continued status within the household. Such moments rarely involved dramatic declarations. Instead, they produced visual reassurance. Guests watching the couple dine together began to understand that the household had regained its balance. The scandal that once threatened the court appeared less important when the legitimate marriage continued to function publicly. The court valued appearances almost as much as reality. Alongside these public appearances, the wife also strengthened another important aspect of noble reputation: religious devotion. Church attendance carried significant symbolic power in Tudor society. Participation in religious ceremonies demonstrated moral authority, humility, and obedience to social order. Noblewomen often used these moments to reinforce their reputation as guardians of family virtue. The wife, therefore, increased her presence in religious life. She attended services regularly, often accompanied by members of her household. Donations to churches or monasteries quietly reinforced the image of piety and responsibility. When nobles observed her praying beside her children or standing respectfully during ceremonies, the message became clear. She represented stability. Religious devotion offered more than spiritual reassurance. It also created distance from the scandal that had once surrounded the court. A woman visibly devoted to faith appeared less vulnerable to gossip and suspicion. In time, courtiers began associating the household once again with dignity rather than controversy. Another powerful symbol strengthened that image even further: motherhood. Within aristocratic society, the role of a mother carried immense political weight. Children represented the future of the family line, the continuation of alliances, and the protection of inherited lands. When the wife appeared publicly beside her children, she reminded the court that legitimacy rested with her household. At ceremonies or celebrations, the presence of the children often attracted attention. A son standing beside his mother reinforced the idea of succession and stability. Daughters participating in court rituals symbolized the future alliances the family would eventually create. Together, they formed a living reminder of the legal structure that sustained aristocratic society. The wife used these moments carefully. She allowed her children to appear beside her during certain events. Courtiers observing these scenes understood the message immediately. The family remained intact. The future of the household still belonged to the legitimate line. Through these carefully controlled appearances, the court slowly adjusted its memory. The scandal faded into the background. Conversations turned instead toward diplomatic negotiations, upcoming marriages, and the ordinary business of court life. The wife had not confronted the mistress openly. She had not demanded public apologies or dramatic gestures of loyalty. Instead, she rebuilt her reputation through visibility, devotion, and family unity. This method required patience, but patience often proved stronger than anger within royal politics. By appearing beside her husband in moments of ceremony, by strengthening her presence within religious life, and by emphasizing her role as mother, the wife reshaped the image of the household before the entire court. Order returned, not through confrontation, but through careful performance. The court now saw a household that appeared stable once again. Public ceremonies, religious devotion, and family unity slowly replaced the memory of scandal. Yet beneath this restored image, a deeper strategy was still unfolding within the private life of the marriage. Royal marriages in Tudor society were never understood as purely private relationships. They were legal institutions, religious obligations, and political foundations all at once. When tension appeared within a household, the consequences extended far beyond the personal feelings of husband and wife. The legal wife understood this structure clearly. Emotional confrontation rarely solves problems in a court governed by hierarchy and reputation. A wife who attempted to win arguments through anger risked appearing unstable or jealous. Such behavior might even strengthen sympathy for the mistress. Instead, the wife relied on something far stronger than personal emotion. She relied on the authority of law and custom. Marriage in Tudor England existed under the protection of both secular law and the authority of the church. These institutions defined the obligations of husband and wife in ways that were widely understood across noble society. A husband might seek personal pleasure outside the marriage, but his public duties toward his wife remained clearly defined. The wife did not need to accuse her husband directly. She only needed to remind the court of these obligations. Such reminders often appeared through subtle gestures rather than public confrontation. Conversations with trusted relatives might quietly emphasize the responsibilities attached to noble marriage. Advisors close to the husband might gently repeat the importance of maintaining dignity within the household. These discussions rarely sounded like accusations. They sounded like reminders of duty. The language of duty carried great power in aristocratic culture. Noblemen were raised to believe that honor depended upon fulfilling their obligations toward family, lineage, and reputation. When those obligations were invoked, they touched something deeper than personal pride. They touched identity. One of the strongest elements within that identity involved responsibility toward legitimate heirs. Sons born within lawful marriage represented the continuation of the family line. Their existence secured inheritance, protected alliances, and reassured noble families that property and titles would remain stable across generations. For this reason, the presence of a legitimate son transformed the balance of power within the household. The wife did not need to argue loudly about her position. The existence of her son already spoke on her behalf. Every time the child appeared beside his parents during ceremonies or family gatherings, he reminded the court where the true future of the household rested. Advisors, relatives, and even diplomats understood this reality. When conversations about family stability arose, the discussion naturally turned toward the importance of protecting the legitimate heir. A household divided by scandal threatened not only reputation but also the security of inheritance. The wife, therefore, allowed the discussion to focus on the child. Protecting the son meant protecting the marriage. Protecting the marriage meant restoring dignity to the household. Without speaking harshly, the wife placed the center of attention exactly where it mattered most. The church also played a crucial role in reinforcing this message. Religious authorities held enormous influence over noble society. Marriage was not merely a legal contract, it was a sacred vow recognized by the church. Clergy often reminded aristocratic families that the stability of marriage reflected the moral health of the entire community. A nobleman who neglected his marriage risked criticism not only from relatives but also from religious leaders. The wife did not need to request such criticism openly. Her visible devotion to religious life already strengthened the church's sympathy toward her position. When priests or bishops spoke about the sanctity of marriage during sermons or private discussions, their words naturally reinforced the obligations placed upon her husband. These messages did not attack him directly. Instead, they described the virtues expected from honorable men. The effect was powerful. A husband who wished to preserve his reputation could not easily ignore such expectations. Public morality, family duty, and religious authority all pointed in the same direction. Gradually, the weight of these expectations reshaped the atmosphere of the household. The husband began to recognize that continuing the affair threatened more than personal comfort. It endangered the dignity of his family, the future of his son, and his own standing within both court and church. The wife had not raised her voice. She had not demanded punishment or humiliation for the mistress. Instead, she allowed law, custom, and moral expectation to surround the situation like a quiet but unavoidable pressure. Within Tudor society, such pressure often proved stronger than confrontation, because reputation depended upon appearing honorable before others. Noblemen frequently adjusted their behavior once those expectations became visible. Through patience and careful understanding of social institutions, the wife transformed the structure of the conversation itself. What had once seemed like a private scandal gradually became a question of duty and legitimacy. And within that framework, the position of the wife remained unshakable. The court now recognized that the marriage rested on law, faith, and the future of the legitimate heir. Conversations no longer centered on passion, but on responsibility and honor. Yet restoring order within the household would soon require a final step that few observers fully anticipated. Royal courts rarely repaired scandals through dramatic announcements. No bell rang to declare that a crisis had ended, and no herald stepped forward to read a proclamation of forgiveness. Instead, order returned through a slower process, one built carefully through silence, patience, and the quiet replacement of one image with another. The wife understood this instinctively. An open apology from the husband might have satisfied curiosity, but it would also have revived the scandal in public memory. Formal declarations often forced the court to repeat the very story the household hoped to bury. Each explanation risked giving gossip new life. Silence, therefore, became the wiser strategy, not a silence born from weakness, but one guided by careful intention. The court noticed that no accusations were spoken. No dramatic confrontation took place in the Great Hall. No public denunciation of the mistress echoed through the palace. Courtiers waiting for such scenes gradually realized that they would never occur. The household chose restraint. Within the culture of Tudor politics, restraint carried its own authority. Noble families often preserved dignity by refusing to speak openly about personal conflict. When silence replaced argument, it suggested that the matter had already been resolved privately. This approach confused gossip at first. Rumors depend upon conflict. They feed on arguments, confessions, and public humiliation. When none of those appeared, the story began losing its energy. Courtiers found fewer details to repeat, and conversations slowly drifted toward other matters. The absence of scandal gradually became more powerful than scandal itself. Yet silence alone would not erase memory. The wife understood that the court needed something else to observe. If old images of betrayal remained vivid, they would continue shaping how the household was perceived. Those images had to be replaced. New images, therefore, appeared. Guests attending the ceremonies saw the husband and wife entering together, their movements calm and controlled. During banquets, they spoke quietly with one another, exchanging gestures that suggested familiarity rather than tension. Their behavior did not appear theatrical or forced. It appeared ordinary, and ordinary life often proved more convincing than dramatic reconciliation. The court observed these moments. When people repeatedly witnessed the couple standing side by side during official occasions, the memory of the scandal began fading into the background. The mind gradually replaced the old story with the new one unfolding before their eyes. Religious ceremonies strengthened this transformation. The wife's presence in church, often accompanied by her children and members of the household, presented a powerful image of stability. When the husband appeared beside her during certain observances, the symbolism became unmistakable. Faith, family, and order stood together once again. Even foreign envoys visiting the court noticed these scenes. Diplomats measured the strength of royal households carefully, searching for signs of weakness or instability. Observing a united family reassured them that the kingdom remained politically secure. The strategy worked precisely because it avoided spectacle. Nothing dramatic occurred. No speech explained the end of the affair. No official document announced reconciliation. No formal punishment forced the mistress into public disgrace. Instead, the court encountered a new visual narrative. The household appeared disciplined. The marriage appeared intact. The family appeared stable. Over time, these repeated impressions reshaped collective memory. People tend to remember what they see most often. When courtiers repeatedly witnessed the husband and wife functioning as a united household, the earlier scandal lost its importance. The court began discussing other subjects: alliances, diplomacy, festivals, and upcoming marriages. The past quietly dissolved. Silence had allowed this transformation to occur without reopening old wounds. By refusing to dramatize the crisis, the wife protected the dignity of the household while guiding the court toward a new understanding of reality. Such restraint required remarkable discipline. Many people in her position might have demanded acknowledgement or revenge, yet revenge often prolonged scandal rather than ending it. The wife recognized that restoring honor demanded something more subtle: control over the story itself. By replacing accusations with carefully chosen images of unity, she allowed the court to forget the details of the affair. What remained visible was not betrayal but stability. And stability, in royal politics, mattered more than truth. The scandal had faded without apology, and the court now remembered only the calm image that replaced it. Silence had accomplished what confrontation could never achieve. One final gesture, quiet and deliberate, would ensure that the former mistress disappeared from the center of power without leaving bitterness behind. Removing a mistress from the center of court life rarely happened through sudden dismissal. Royal households understood that open humiliation could easily create new scandals. If a former favorite left the palace in anger or disgrace, her story might travel through noble circles and revive the very rumors the household hoped to bury. The wife, therefore, approached the problem carefully. A quiet solution always proved safer than dramatic punishment. Instead of forcing the mistress out, the household arranged a path that allowed her departure to appear respectable. Such arrangements were common in aristocratic society, where reputation mattered as much as reality. Marriage provided the most convenient answer. A suitable husband could transform the situation instantly. Once the mistress became the wife of another nobleman or gentleman, her presence at court naturally faded. Social expectations would guide her toward her new household, far from the delicate politics of the royal residence. Finding such a husband required discretion. The man chosen for this role rarely belonged to the highest ranks of the nobility. A powerful nobleman might hesitate to marry a woman whose past involvement with the royal household remained widely known. Instead, the arrangement often involved a gentleman of respectable status but limited political ambition. This balance allowed the solution to appear honorable. The mistress gained the security of marriage, while the household avoided creating a rival center of influence. Courtiers observing the arrangement could interpret it as a gesture of generosity rather than exile. Once the husband had been chosen, the household ensured that the transition unfolded smoothly. A modest dowry often accompanied the marriage. The sum rarely matched the wealth granted to brides of powerful noble families. Yet it provided enough comfort to prevent resentment. Such financial support suggested that the mistress had not been cast aside without consideration. Money in these circumstances served a practical purpose. It protected silence. A woman who left the palace with some measure of security possessed little incentive to reopen old stories. The dowry allowed her new household to begin life with dignity, reinforcing the idea that her departure had occurred with goodwill rather than bitterness. Observers within the court quickly recognized the elegance of this arrangement. No scandal accompanied the transition. No accusations circulated through the corridors. No dramatic confrontation disturbed the careful calm that had returned to the palace. Instead, the mistress simply became someone else's wife. With the marriage arranged, the next step unfolded naturally. Her new husband often possessed lands or responsibilities, located far from the royal residence. A country estate provided distance from the palace and from the complex web of relationships that once surrounded her. Life in such a setting demanded attention to household management, tenants, and local obligations. Court intrigue rarely travelled easily into rural quiet. From the perspective of the palace, this relocation achieved several goals at once. The mistress left the centre of attention without humiliation. Her new life appeared respectable and stable. Most importantly, the royal household regained control over its reputation without provoking sympathy for a wronged woman. Distance completed the transformation. Within weeks, the court noticed that her presence had vanished from banquets, religious ceremonies, and diplomatic receptions. New faces filled the spaces she once occupied. Conversations that once mentioned her name gradually stopped. Time finished what strategy had begun. Without constant visibility, memory weakened. Courtiers who had once followed every detail of the affair found other matters more interesting. Political alliances, military campaigns, and upcoming marriages soon replaced old gossip. The mistress herself rarely returned to the palace. Her new responsibilities encouraged a quieter life centered on her husband's estate. Whether she felt relief, resignation, or lingering disappointment remained known only to her. The court, however, no longer needed to concern itself with those emotions. For the wife, the strategy succeeded without cruelty. The household had avoided scandal, protected its reputation, and allowed the former mistress to leave with dignity rather than disgrace. No public punishment had been necessary. No dramatic exile had taken place. Instead, the court witnessed a graceful disappearance. Through careful planning, a potentially explosive conflict ended in a calm transition. The mistress's departure appeared almost natural, as though the court had simply continued moving forward while she stepped quietly into another life. In royal politics, such outcomes were rarely accidental. They were the result of patience, calculation, and an understanding that reputation often depended on how endings were arranged. The mistress had left the palace with dignity, and the court quickly accepted the calm that followed her departure. Her absence restored balance to the household without creating new whispers in the corridors. Another challenge quietly remained. Because the future of the family still depended on protecting the children from the shadow of scandal. Children often carried the consequences of scandals they had never created. Within aristocratic families, reputation did not belong to individuals alone. It belonged to the entire lineage. When rumors surrounded a household, the shadow of those rumors could easily extend to the next generation. The wife understood this danger clearly. Restoring order within the marriage had already stabilized the court. Yet another task remained equally important. The future of the family depended on protecting the legitimacy and authority of the children born within the lawful union. Without careful management, even distant whispers of scandal could weaken their position. The first step involved creating distance between different branches of the family. Children born outside the legal marriage sometimes existed within noble households, particularly when a husband had maintained relationships before or during his marriage. Their presence was rarely discussed openly, yet everyone within the court understood the sensitive balance surrounding them. Allowing those children to remain too close to the center of the household could invite unnecessary comparisons. The wife, therefore, encouraged a quiet separation. Illegitimate children were often raised in other residences connected to the family. They might live under the care of trusted relatives, distant estates, or households that maintained loyalty to the father while remaining removed from court politics. Such arrangements allowed the children to receive support without challenging the visible structure of legitimacy. Distance protected everyone involved. The children themselves avoided becoming symbols of scandal within the court. The household avoided constant reminders of past controversy. Most importantly, the line of inheritance remained clear to all observers. At the same time, the wife strengthened the position of her own children. Public visibility played a crucial role in this effort. When legitimate heirs appeared beside their parents during ceremonies or important gatherings, they reminded the court of the lawful continuity of the family. A son standing beside his father during official occasions symbolized stability and future leadership. These appearances rarely required elaborate statements. The image alone carried meaning. Courtiers, observing the child, began associating him with the authority of the household rather than with the rumors that once circulated around it. Over time, the presence of the legitimate heir shifted attention away from the past and toward the future of the family. Education formed another essential element of protection. Aristocratic children were raised not only to inherit titles, but also to represent the honor of their lineage. Tutors, scholars, and mentors shaped their understanding of duty, diplomacy, and leadership. Through careful education, the family ensured that the next generation would embody the dignity expected of their position. The wife monitored this process closely. Her son's education often emphasized discipline, moral responsibility, and loyalty to the family name. Lessons in governance, a religion, and etiquette prepared him for the expectations he would eventually carry as head of the household. Each stage of his upbringing reinforced the message that legitimacy came with responsibility. The court noticed these preparations. Visitors observed the young heir learning beside respected tutors or accompanying his parents during formal occasions. Such moments reassured noble families that the household remained capable of guiding the next generation towards stability. Daughters also played an important role. Within aristocratic society, Daughters often formed the bridge between families through marriage alliances. Their education focused on diplomacy, household management, and the careful cultivation of reputation. By raising daughters who embodied grace and discipline, the wife strengthened the family's future alliances. Through these efforts, the children gradually became symbols of renewal. The court no longer discussed the scandal that once threatened the household. Instead, attention shifted toward the promising future represented by the next generation. Marriage negotiations, educational achievements, and public ceremonies slowly replaced older stories in the memory of the court. Time reinforced this transformation. Years passed, and the children matured into adults who carried the dignity of their family with confidence. By the time they assumed greater responsibilities, few people remembered the rumors that once surrounded their parents. Protection had succeeded. The wife had not merely repaired the reputation of her marriage, she had ensured that the next generation would inherit a household defined by stability rather than scandal. Such foresight revealed the deeper nature of her strategy. Reputation within aristocratic society was never about the present alone. It was about the long chain of inheritance stretching into the future. By guarding the position of her children and guiding their development carefully, the wife protected the family name long after the court had forgotten the drama that once threatened it. The children now represented a future stronger than the fading memory of scandal. Their presence reassured the court that the family's legacy remained secure. A quieter task still waited within the walls of the household, because lasting stability depended on rebuilding trust between husband and wife. Restoring order in public was only half of the work. Courts could be convinced through ceremonies, appearances, and carefully managed reputations. Yet the true stability of a noble household depended on something quieter and far more fragile: the private relationship between husband and wife. After the scandal faded from public conversation, the marriage itself still carried the memory of the crisis. Reconciliation rarely arrived through dramatic declarations. Noble couples rarely spoke openly about emotional wounds, especially in societies where dignity and restraint were valued above confession. Instead, reconciliation unfolded slowly through routine, a beat, and the quiet rebuilding of trust. The wife understood that the household required calm more than explanation. Arguments about the past would only reopen tensions that the court had already begun to forget. For that reason, the effort to stabilize the marriage often took the form of small, deliberate gestures. Shared presence became one of the first signals. The couple began appearing together in ordinary moments within the palace. They walked side by side through the gardens. They attended meals with their children. During smaller gatherings with relatives, they spoke with the familiarity expected of a long-established marriage. These moments were rarely dramatic, but repetition gave them power. Servants, attendants, and relatives observed these interactions closely. The behavior of the household leaders shaped the emotional atmosphere of everyone around them. When husband and wife appeared comfortable in one another's presence, the rest of the household gradually relaxed. Routine replaced uncertainty. Another important step involved establishing new boundaries within the marriage itself. Before the scandal, the husband may have exercised a freedom that allowed private relationships to flourish without restraint. After the crisis, however, both partners understood that certain limits had to exist if stability was to endure. These limits rarely appeared in written agreements. They existed through mutual understanding. The husband recognized that his public conduct now carried heavier consequences than before. Any new rumor could easily revive the memory of a past scandal. Protecting the dignity of the household, therefore, required greater caution in his private behavior. The wife, in turn, understood that reconciliation required patience. Maintaining constant suspicion would weaken the very stability she had worked so carefully to rebuild. Instead, she chose a quieter form of authority, one that guided the household without openly questioning every action of her husband. This balance created a new structure within the marriage. Respect replaced confrontation. Distance replaced accusation. Responsibility replaced indulgence. The presence of the household staff made this balance even more important. Servants formed the invisible observers of aristocratic life. They witnessed conversations, gestures, and daily routines that the outside world rarely saw. Within large households, rumors often traveled through servants before reaching the ears of courtiers. For this reason, unity between husband and wife had to appear convincing within the private spaces of the palace. The couple, therefore, presented a calm and disciplined partnership before their attendants. Orders were given jointly. Decisions about household management appeared coordinated. When disagreements arose, they were handled quietly rather than publicly. Such behavior reinforced authority. Servants who believed the household leaders remained united were far less likely to spread stories of division. Stability within the private sphere prevented new gossip from forming in the first place. Over time, these routines reshaped the emotional rhythm of the household. The crisis that once threatened the marriage gradually transformed into a distant memory. The husband adapted to the renewed expectations surrounding his position. The wife continued guiding the household with the steady patience that had already restored its reputation. Trust did not return instantly, but it returned gradually. Years later, observers might struggle to recall the details of the scandal that once stirred so much curiosity within the court. What remained visible instead was the enduring structure of the family itself, a marriage that had survived turmoil and re-established order through discipline and restraint. In an aristocratic society, such resilience carried enormous value. The strength of a household was measured not by the absence of conflict, but by the ability to restore stability after conflict appeared, through patience, strategic restraint, and quiet authority. The wife ensured that her household moved forward rather than remaining trapped by the mistakes of the past. The palace once again functioned as a place of order rather than rumor, and that order began within the marriage itself. The household now appeared calm both in public and in private. Servants, relatives, and courtiers accepted the restored rhythm of family life without question. Outside the palace walls, however, the wider court had begun noticing something else entirely: the quiet return of political balance that followed the restoration of domestic order. Royal courts rarely announce the return of stability. No official proclamation is issued. No trumpet signals that tension has passed. Instead, the shift reveals itself gradually, through small changes in how people behave, speak, and observe one another. The palace corridors begin to feel different. For many months, those same corridors had carried a quiet tension. Servants lowered their voices when passing near certain chambers. Courtiers watched every interaction between husband and wife, measuring distance, tone, and gesture as if they were studying signs of political weather. Every glance held a question. Was the marriage stable? Would another scandal erupt? Could the household still command respect? Such uncertainty shaped the rhythm of daily life. Conversations often paused when the couple entered a room. Guests studied their expressions during banquets. Even visiting diplomats paid close attention, because the health of a noble household could influence alliances far beyond the palace. Gradually, however, that careful observation began to fade. The couple appeared together so often that their presence no longer felt unusual. Shared meals, public ceremonies, and quiet moments within the palace gardens slowly replaced memories of the crisis that had once fascinated the court. Repetition created familiarity. Familiarity created calm. Courtiers, who once whispered about the affair, now found fewer reasons to continue the discussion. New matters demanded their attention: political negotiations, marriages between noble families, disputes over land, and preparations for diplomatic visits. The court always preferred movement over memory. When stability returned, curiosity moved elsewhere. Another sign of this transformation appeared in the way people looked at the household. Months earlier, observers often studied the wife with cautious sympathy. Some wondered whether she would lose influence. Others measured her reactions carefully, trying to predict how the household might respond to the scandal. Now those searching glances disappeared. People greeted her with the calm respect reserved for a woman whose position no longer required explanation. Conversations resumed their normal rhythm in her presence. Courtiers spoke freely, confident that the crisis had passed. The same shift occurred in the tone of conversation across the palace. Rumours once travelled quickly through servants, attendants, and visiting nobles. Every private gesture had inspired speculation. The mistress's name had circulated quietly through the corridors, sometimes accompanied by exaggerated stories. That pattern slowly dissolved. Without fresh conflict to sustain the story, gossip lost its urgency. Conversations that once focused on scandal now turned toward politics, alliance, and court ceremony. Even those who had once followed every detail of the affair seemed to forget its importance. Silence replaced curiosity. The court preferred peace to prolonged intrigue. Servants felt this change just as clearly. Household staff often sensed shifts in the atmosphere before anyone else. Their daily routines brought them close to the private life of the palace, allowing them to observe moods, gestures, and habits that courtiers rarely saw. When tension faded between husband and wife, servants noticed immediately. Orders were delivered calmly. Meals unfolded without awkward pauses. The quiet rhythm of domestic life returned to its usual balance. Within a large household, such details shaped the emotional climate for everyone who lived and worked inside the palace walls. Confidence gradually replaced uncertainty. Foreign envoys visiting the court also sensed the transformation. Diplomats studied royal households carefully because internal instability could signal political weakness. Observing a united family reassured them that alliances remained secure and negotiations could proceed without fear of disruption. Stability at home strengthened authority abroad. The court began breathing again. No single moment marked the exact return of order. Instead, the transformation unfolded through dozens of small changes. Glances that no longer lingered. Conversations that no longer paused. Routines that no longer carried tension. The palace simply resumed its normal life. In time, many people struggled to recall precisely when the scandal had ended. The memory blurred into the background of court history, overshadowed by the ordinary flow of political events and social ceremonies. What remained visible was not the conflict, but the calm that followed it. Through patience and quiet discipline, the household had restored its balance without spectacle or revenge. The court accepted this stability almost gratefully, as though everyone had grown tired of watching the crisis unfold. Peace, after all, allowed the machinery of power to continue moving. The court now recognized that the order had quietly returned to the household. Suspicion had faded, and conversation moved easily through the palace once again. Beneath that calm surface, however, a deeper lesson had begun taking shape about the power of patience in a world ruled by ambition. Power inside a royal court rarely belonged to the person who reacted first. In many cases, the advantage belonged to the person who waited. The wife understood this long before the scandal reached its height. When the affair first began, many people expected a dramatic confrontation. Courts often thrive on visible conflict. Courtiers secretly hope to witness accusations, public humiliation, or sudden reversals of fortune. These moments feed gossip and create new political opportunities for ambitious observers. Yet the wife did something unexpected. She did not react immediately. From the outside, this silence puzzled the court. Some believed it meant weakness. Others assumed she lacked the courage to challenge the situation directly. A few even suspected that her influence within the household had already begun to fade. Those interpretations spread quickly through the palace. But the wife understood something many observers overlooked. Passion rarely lasts forever. Affairs that burn brightly in the early stages often weaken under the weight of routine, responsibility, and time. What appears powerful in the moment can slowly lose its intensity once the excitement fades and the realities of court life return. The wife, therefore, allowed time to do part of the work. Instead of confronting the situation while the relationship still carried emotional momentum, she waited. Waiting required extraordinary discipline. Every rumor, every glance, every whispered conversation within the palace might have tempted her to respond with anger. But anger would have strengthened the affair rather than weakening it. Open conflict often transforms private relationships into public drama. If the wife had confronted the mistress during the height of the affair, the court might have interpreted the scandal as a struggle for power. The mistress could have gained sympathy as the target of jealousy. Silence prevented that transformation. While the court speculated about her motives, the wife quietly observed the natural rhythm of the relationship. Over time, the intensity between the husband and the mistress began to change. What once felt exciting gradually became complicated. Responsibilities returned. Political obligations demanded attention. Court ceremonies required discipline. Diplomatic negotiations consumed the husband's energy. The space for private indulgence slowly narrowed. At the same time, the mistress's position became more fragile. As curiosity faded within the court, her presence no longer attracted the same fascination. What once seemed bold began to appear inconvenient. Time shifted the balance of power. The wife waited for that moment carefully. When the affair lost its emotional intensity, the husband's priorities naturally began moving back toward stability. Reputation, inheritance, and public authority gradually regained their importance. That was the moment the wife had been waiting for. Acting too early would have strengthened the mistress's influence. Acting too late might have allowed the scandal to damage the household permanently. Timing, therefore, became the most important element of strategy. Once the balance shifted, the wife began guiding events quietly. Her allies among noblewomen strengthened their support. Public appearances beside her husband reinforced the image of stability. The social circles of the court gradually moved away from the mistress and back toward the legitimate household. None of these actions appeared dramatic, but their effectiveness depended entirely on patience. Because the wife waited until passion had already begun fading, the court interpreted her actions differently. Instead of appearing jealous or desperate, she appeared calm and controlled. Her decisions looked like the restoration of order rather than the pursuit of revenge. Patience changed the meaning of every gesture. In royal politics, perception often mattered more than intention. A strategy executed at the right moment could transform the entire narrative surrounding a crisis. The wife's restraint allowed the court to see her not as a victim of scandal, but as the guardian of stability. Over time, this reputation strengthened her authority. Courtiers began respecting the discipline she had shown during the most difficult period of the household's history. Her silence during the crisis appeared less like weakness and more like strategic wisdom. Power had returned to her hands without open conflict. The court rarely celebrated such victories openly, yet many observers understood the lesson unfolding before them. The wife had demonstrated that influence within the palace did not always depend on dramatic action. Sometimes influence depended on waiting, and when the moment finally arrived, patience allowed a quiet decision to reshape the entire balance of power. The court now admired the calm strength that patience had revealed. What once appeared to be silence now looked like a deliberate strategy. Through that patience, the wife had begun reshaping not only her household, but the very memory the court would carry about the crisis itself. Courts rarely remember events exactly as they happened. Memory inside a palace behaves like a living thing, shaped constantly by stories, symbols, and repeated images. Over time, what people recall often depends less on the original event and more on what they see afterward. The wife understood this principle well. The scandal had already faded from daily conversation. But fading was not the same as disappearance. Memories could return unexpectedly if someone chose to revive them. A careless remark, a jealous rival, or an ambitious courtier might easily reopen the old story. For this reason, the wife did not simply rely on silence. She began shaping what the court would remember. The most effective way to influence memory was not through words, but through visible action. Instead of discussing the past, the household created new scenes that replaced older images in the minds of observers. Courtiers began noticing these scenes almost immediately. The wife appeared frequently beside her husband at public events, religious ceremonies, seasonal celebrations, and diplomatic gatherings provided opportunities for the couple to present a calm and unified presence. Guests saw the family moving through the palace with quiet dignity. These repeated appearances slowly rewrote the visual memory of the court. Where people once imagined tension, they now saw stability. Where gossip once focused on betrayal, attention shifted toward cooperation and order. Each new scene quietly replaced an older one. Memory adapted to what it observed most often. The wife also understood that reputation within noble society depended heavily on generosity and cultural patronage. Supporting artists, musicians, and charitable causes allowed a household to influence how others spoke about it. Soon, the palace began sponsoring new artistic works. Painters received commissions to create portraits of the family. Musicians performed during celebrations arranged by the household. Religious institutions received donations that strengthened the wife's image as a patron of faith and community. These activities did more than display wealth. They created new stories. When artists painted scenes of the household, they captured moments of harmony and dignity. A portrait showing husband, a wife, and children standing together became more powerful than any rumor circulating through the court. Such images traveled across noble circles, shaping how people imagined the family. Art quietly replaced scandal. Charitable works reinforced this transformation. Donations to churches, hospitals, or community projects gave the household a reputation for generosity. People began speaking about the wife's devotion and kindness rather than about the earlier crisis. Every charitable act redirected attention. The court gradually adopted a new narrative. Instead of remembering a scandal that once threatened the household, observers began associating the family with stability, faith, and responsibility. Over time, the earlier story faded into something distant and uncertain. Like a rumor that no longer felt important, symbols played a crucial role in this process. Public ceremonies often featured the family in positions of honor. Banners displaying the household's heraldry appeared during festivals. Portraits hung in prominent chambers of the palace, reinforcing the image of a united lineage. Each symbol carried meaning. Together, they formed a visual language that guided how people interpreted the household's history. Anyone entering the palace saw evidence of continuity rather than conflict. The old story gradually disappeared from collective memory. Courtiers who once followed every detail of the scandal found themselves speaking instead about the household's generosity, artistic patronage, and devotion to religious institutions. The wife had replaced a narrative of instability with one of cultural authority. This transformation required patience and careful planning. Rewriting memory could never happen through force. People rarely forget something simply because they are told to forget. They forget when new experiences become more vivid than the old ones. The wife ensured that those new experiences appeared everywhere. Paintings, ceremonies, charitable acts, and family portraits filled the palace with images of unity. Over time, those images became the dominant memory shared by the court. The scandal still existed in the past, but it no longer defined the present. Through deliberate action, the wife had guided the court toward a different understanding of the household story. She had not erased history, yet she had replaced its meaning with something stronger. Control over memory had become a form of power. The court now remembered the household through symbols of stability, rather than whispers of scandal. New images had replaced the old story almost entirely. In that transformed memory, the wife's role began to appear very different from what observers once believed. Courts often misunderstand the role of a wife within aristocratic power. To many observers, the wife appears passive, bound by tradition and limited by the authority of her husband. She is often imagined as a silent figure who endures humiliation while political decisions unfold around her. The scandal had once encouraged this perception. When the affair first became visible within the palace, many courtiers quietly assumed that the wife had become a victim of circumstances beyond her control. They watched her movements carefully, expecting signs of weakness, anger, or despair. Yet the passing months began revealing a different reality. The wife had never truly been powerless. What the court had initially interpreted as silence gradually revealed itself as discipline. What seemed like patience began to resemble strategy. The household's recovery from scandal did not occur by accident. It unfolded through decisions made quietly but deliberately. Observers slowly began reconsidering their assumptions. The wife was no longer viewed merely as the injured partner in a troubled marriage. Her actions had restored the reputation of the household, stabilized its alliances, and guided the court away from destructive gossip. These achievements carried political weight. Within aristocratic society, the stability of noble families formed the foundation of political order. Alliances between families determined the balance of influence within the court. When a household lost its reputation, the consequences often extended beyond personal embarrassment into diplomatic uncertainty. By restoring the dignity of the marriage, the wife had protected more than her own position. She had protected the political equilibrium of the court itself. Courtiers who once whispered about scandal now began acknowledging her influence more openly, not through formal declarations, but through subtle changes in behavior. Advisors listened more carefully when she spoke. Noblewomen sought her presence at gatherings. Even diplomats recognized the importance of her role within the royal household. Her authority emerged from stability. While passion often produced excitement within courts, stability produced trust. The wife represented continuity to discipline and responsibility, qualities that political systems depend upon far more than fleeting fascination. In this way, her position slowly evolved. She was no longer defined by the scandal that once threatened the household. Instead, she became associated with the restoration that followed it. Her presence symbolized the quiet force capable of preserving order when ambition or emotion threatened to disrupt it. This transformation reshaped how the court understood power. Many courtiers had once believed that influence belonged primarily to men who held official titles, commanded armies, or negotiated treaties. The wife's actions revealed another form of authority. One, operating through social networks, reputation, and patient strategy. Such authority often remained invisible until a crisis exposed its necessity. Through careful timing, disciplined silence, and strategic alliances, the wife had demonstrated that the stability of a household could depend as much on her decisions as on those of her husband. The court slowly absorbed this lesson. Noble families began viewing her not merely as a spouse, but as a guardian of political continuity. Her role extended beyond domestic management into the preservation of alliances, reputation, and long-term family interests. Within aristocratic society, these responsibilities carried enormous significance. A household that maintained stability through a crisis strengthened the broader network of noble power surrounding it. Other families trusted alliances with those who demonstrated resilience and discipline under pressure. The wife had proven capable of that resilience. Her influence, therefore, extended beyond her immediate household. She became an example of how authority could be exercised without dramatic confrontation. Through patience and understanding of social dynamics, she had reshaped the court's perception of her role. The transformation was subtle but lasting. The same courtiers who once watched her with curiosity now regarded her with respect. they no longer interpreted her silence as weakness. Instead, they recognized it as a form of control that allowed her to guide events without provoking unnecessary conflict. Over time, this new perception solidified. The wife had moved beyond the role of victim. She had become the figure who ensured the household remained steady, even when internal tensions threatened to disrupt it. Her strength lay not in public triumph, but in lasting equilibrium. Courts eventually forget the excitement of scandals, but they remember the individuals who restore balance after chaos. By preserving the dignity of the marriage, protecting the future of the children, and guiding the court away from destructive rumors, the wife had redefined the meaning of her position. She was not merely a participant in the household, she was its center of gravity. The court now viewed the wife through a different lens than before. Her patience and discipline had transformed scandal into stability and restored confidence in the household's future. Through this transformation, the court began recognizing a deeper truth about power within aristocratic life. Royal palaces have always been places where passion attracts attention faster than discipline. A sudden romance, a whispered affair, or a forbidden relationship can capture the imagination of everyone who lives within the walls of the court. For a brief moment, emotion appears stronger than rules, and desire seems capable of bending even the most rigid traditions of noble life. That illusion rarely survives the passage of time. The affair that once dominated every conversation in the palace had once seemed unstoppable. Servants carried fragments of rumor through corridors lined with stone. Courtiers lowered their voices during banquets, pretending not to gossip while doing precisely that. Foreign envoys quietly studied the situation, wondering whether the private life of the household might soon disturb the political balance of the court. Passion had filled the air like a sudden storm. For a time, it seemed to change everything. Attention focused almost entirely on the relationship itself. People speculated about its future, about the reactions of the wife, about whether the household might fracture under the pressure of scandal. The mistress appeared powerful simply because she stood at the center of the court's curiosity. Yet curiosity is not the same as power. As weeks turned into months, the emotional intensity that had once fueled the affair began to weaken. Court life demanded structure and discipline. Political obligations continued without pause. Ceremonies, diplomatic meetings, and religious observances filled the days with responsibilities that left little room for endless fascination. The palace gradually returned to its routine. What remained after the excitement faded was something far more serious. Reputation. Within aristocratic society, reputation functions as the invisible foundation beneath every alliance and every inheritance. Noble families depend on it to secure marriages, maintain trust, and preserve their authority across generations. When reputation collapses, the consequences rarely remain confined to personal embarrassment. They spread outward. Land, titles, alliances, and political influence all become vulnerable when a household loses its dignity in the eyes of others. For that reason, aristocratic families often treat reputation as something more valuable than momentary happiness. The wife understood this truth long before the court did. While others became absorbed by the spectacle of the affair, she focused on the long arc of time that defines noble history. Passion might dominate a season, but reputation determines which families remain powerful decades later. Her actions reflected that understanding from the beginning. Instead of responding to the scandal with dramatic accusations, she chose restraint. Instead of turning the crisis into open conflict, she guided the household quietly towards stability. Each decision she made aimed not at winning a personal argument, but at preserving the family's long-term dignity. The difference between those two goals shaped everything that followed. Courtiers, who had once watched the scandal with fascination, eventually came to recognize the deeper structure underlying her silence. The mistress had represented excitement and emotional intensity. The wife represented legitimacy, continuity, and the future of the household. Legitimacy. Unlike passion, does not fade quickly. Each public appearance beside her husband strengthened the image of a stable marriage. Each ceremony attended with calm dignity reminded observers that the household remained united. Each careful decision regarding the children and the family's alliances reinforced the authority of the legitimate lineage. These actions accumulated gradually. Reputation does not rebuild itself in a single moment. It grows slowly, through repeated evidence that stability has returned. Months passed. New political developments captured the court's attention. Marriage negotiations between noble families filled the halls with fresh discussions. The scandal that once seemed overwhelming began to feel distant. People spoke about it less frequently. Some courtiers struggled to recall the precise details of what had happened. Others remembered only fragments of rumor, overshadowed by the visible calm that now defined the household. Memory itself had begun to change. What the court remembered most clearly was not the affair, but the quiet restoration that followed it. Observers began associating the household with discipline rather than controversy. The wife's presence came to symbolize reliability in a world where ambition often created instability. History tends to remember such transformations. Chronicles rarely preserve every whispered scandal from palace life. Instead, they record the families who maintained their influence, protected their reputation, and guided their households through moments of crisis without allowing chaos to prevail. In that larger historical memory, patience often proves stronger than passion. The wife had understood this from the beginning. Her strategy never depended on humiliating the mistress or exposing the affair to greater public scrutiny. Instead, she focused on protecting the family's name, ensuring that the household would continue commanding respect long after the excitement of the scandal disappeared. Reputation became the battlefield, and time became her strongest ally. As the court continued its endless cycle of ceremonies, negotiations, and celebrations, the earlier affair faded into something that felt almost insignificant. The palace moved forward, as it always does, toward new alliances and new ambitions. What remained visible was the structure of the household itself. Stable, disciplined, rooted in legitimacy, the wife had preserved that structure through patience and strategic restraint. The court might never openly acknowledge the depth of her influence, yet its behavior revealed the truth. Respect had returned to the household, and with it came the quiet recognition that reputation, once protected and restored, outlasts every fleeting moment of desire. The court slowly accepted a lesson that only time could teach. Passion had once shaken the palace with noise and excitement. Reputation, rebuilt through patience and discipline, endured long after the echoes of that excitement had disappeared. Victory inside a royal household rarely feels like triumph. When stability finally returns after a scandal, the court often celebrates the calm that follows. Courtiers speak about restored order. Diplomats observe renewed confidence. And the palace resumes its steady rhythm of ceremonies and negotiations. Yet the private cost of that stability often remains invisible. The wife understood this better than anyone. From the outside, her strategy appeared calm and controlled. She had waited patiently while the affair burned through the court's attention. She had allowed time to weaken the relationship that once threatened the dignity of the household. She had guided the palace back toward stability without creating a second scandal through confrontation. Observers admired that discipline. What they rarely considered was the emotional cost that discipline required. Aristocratic life did not provide many spaces for private expression of pain. Noblewomen were expected to preserve dignity even when their personal lives became the subject of public speculation. Tears, anger, or open confrontation risked weakening their authority within the court. For that reason, the wife carried her injuries quietly. The betrayal that had once shocked the household could not be discussed openly. Speaking about it would revive the very scandal she had worked so carefully to erase. Even within private conversations, restraint remained necessary. Silence, therefore, replaced confession. This silence served an important political purpose. It allowed the household to move forward without reopening the wounds of the past. The court gradually forgot the details of the affair, precisely because those details were never repeated. But silence also demanded emotional sacrifice. The wife could not express the anger that many people might have considered justified. She could not allow resentment to dominate her behavior toward her husband. Even when memories of humiliation returned, she had to maintain the calm presence expected from the center of the household. Control over emotion became part of her duty. In aristocratic culture, personal feelings often yielded to the needs of the family. Noble marriages functioned not only as private relationships, but as alliances connecting multiple lineages. When a crisis threatened that alliance, preserving the structure of the family often required individuals to suppress their personal suffering. The wife accepted that burden. Protecting the future of her children demanded it. The legitimacy of the heirs depended upon a stable household. If the marriage collapsed publicly, the consequences could extend far beyond wounded pride. Inheritance, alliance, and political trust might all suffer. Her silence, therefore, protected more than her reputation. It protected the future of the family itself. Even within the private chambers of the palace, this responsibility shaped her behavior. Servants and attendants observed the emotional atmosphere of the household closely. A visible conflict between husband and wife could easily revive rumors that the court had already begun to forget. Maintaining calm within those walls became essential. The wife, therefore, mastered a quiet form of endurance. She learned to separate personal pain from public responsibility. The two emotions did not disappear, but they no longer controlled her actions. Over time, this discipline transformed how others perceived her. Courtiers who once watched her with curiosity began to respect her composure. They saw a woman who had faced humiliation without allowing it to destroy the household she represented. Her silence, once interpreted as weakness, gradually appeared as strength. Strength built from restraint. Yet that strength did not erase the emotional cost. Some wounds within noble families remain unspoken for generations. They survive in memory, carried privately by those who experienced them, but rarely described openly in the chronicles of court life. Historians record the restoration of reputation, the preservation of alliances, and the stability of the household. They rarely record the quiet endurance behind those outcomes. The wife accepted this reality. Her role required her to think beyond personal satisfaction. The success of her strategy lay not in revenge or public apology, but in the preservation of the family's future. If the court now viewed the household as stable, her sacrifice had achieved its purpose. The palace moved forward. Ceremonies continued. Alliances strengthened. The children grew into the roles they would eventually inherit. The scandal that once filled every conversation faded into something distant and almost forgotten. Only the wife fully understood the cost that silence had required. And yet she continued carrying that silence. Because the survival of the household had always mattered more than the expression of personal grief. The court saw only the restored stability of the household. Behind that calm surface, however, the emotional sacrifices that made such stability possible remained carefully hidden. Over time, those sacrifices would shape how the court understood the quiet strength of women who preserved order without ever demanding recognition. Power in a royal court is often imagined as something loud and visible. People expect authority to appear through commands, proclamations, or dramatic victories. Kings issue orders. Ministers debate policy. Generals command armies. These visible actions dominate the chronicles that describe the life of the court. Yet another form of power exists beside this louder one. It moves quietly. The wife had come to embody that quieter form of authority. Throughout the crisis that once threatened the household, she had never demanded public recognition for her actions. She had not confronted her rivals in dramatic scenes. She had not sought applause for restoring stability to the family. Instead, Her influence unfolded through something more subtle: control over circumstances. Within aristocratic society, the ability to guide the environment around a conflict often mattered more than defeating an opponent directly. Open victories could create resentment or humiliation, which sometimes sparked new rivalries. Quiet control, by contrast, allowed the structure of the household to change without provoking resistance. The wife understood this instinctively. Rather than confronting the mistress publicly, she adjusted the social atmosphere of the court. Invitations changed. Alliances shifted. Public appearances reshaped the court's perception of the marriage. Over time, these small adjustments gradually moved the household back towards stability. Observers often struggled to identify the exact moment when the balance shifted. That uncertainty was part of the strategy. If a single dramatic event had marked the defeat of the mistress, the court would have remembered the conflict as a spectacle. Some courtiers might even have sympathized with the defeated rival. Instead, the transition unfolded so gradually that many people barely noticed when the center of influence returned to the wife. Quiet power leaves few clear footprints. The court eventually began recognizing the effectiveness of this approach. Noblewomen and advisors who watched the events unfold understood that the wife had exercised a form of authority rarely described in political treatises. She had controlled the context in which decisions were made. By shaping how the court perceived events, she influenced outcomes without issuing commands. Courtiers adjusted their behavior naturally in response to the atmosphere she created. Alliances realigned themselves without open instruction. This method of influence required patience and discipline. It demanded an understanding of how reputation, symbolism, and social networks shaped the behavior of aristocratic society. The wife had mastered those elements through careful observation and restraint. Her authority, therefore, grew without confrontation. Many observers began seeing her as a model of quiet strength. She represented a type of leadership often overlooked within the history of royal courts. While men frequently claimed victory through public acts of power, she had achieved stability through invisible guidance. Her success did not depend on defeating anyone openly. It depended on preserving order. Within aristocratic households, order carried enormous value. Stability protected inheritance, maintained alliances, and ensured that the family's reputation remained intact across generations. A wife who could protect that stability performed a role as essential as any minister or advisor. The court gradually acknowledged this truth. Noblewomen who watched her example understood the lesson clearly. Authority did not always require dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it required patience, restraint, and a careful understanding of how social environments shape human behavior. Through these qualities, the wife had transformed a moment of crisis into a demonstration of quiet leadership. Her influence now extended beyond her own household. Other families began viewing her as a symbol of disciplined authority. Mothers teaching their daughters about court life might describe her example as proof that dignity and patience could overcome scandal without creating further chaos. This recognition did not appear through formal titles. It appeared through respect. When she entered a hall, conversations often paused, not because she demanded attention, but because her presence carried weight. Courtiers recognized the steadiness she represented within a world where ambition frequently produced instability. Her victory had never been about humiliation or revenge. It had always been about preserving order. In royal politics, such victories rarely produce applause. They produce something far more valuable: a stable household capable of guiding the future of its lineage. The wife had achieved exactly that, and she had done so without ever raising her voice. The court now saw her not merely as a wife, but as the quiet force that had preserved stability when scandal threatened the household. Her example revealed that authority does not always require noise or spectacle. Sometimes, the greatest victories remain invisible, hidden within the calm order they leave behind. Royal households rarely survive by emotion alone. Love may begin a marriage. Jealousy may ignite a scandal. and passion may capture the attention of the entire court for a brief and dramatic season. Yet none of those forces is strong enough to sustain a noble household across time. Survival requires something else. The crisis that once shook the palace had never truly been about romance. To the courtiers, who watched from the edges of the great hall, the affair may have seemed like a story of rivalry between two women, or a tale of wounded pride inside a troubled marriage. Such interpretations made the scandal easier to understand. But the deeper reality was far more complex. Inside aristocratic society, reputation forms the foundation upon which every alliance, inheritance, and political decision rests. When reputation collapses, the structure of a household begins to weaken in ways that can affect generations. Land, titles, and diplomatic trust all depend on the belief that a family remains stable and worthy of respect. The wife understood this clearly from the beginning. Her actions were never driven purely by emotion. She did not rebuild the household simply to win back affection or to defeat a rival in a personal contest. The stakes had always been larger than either of those motivations. The survival of the family required order. If the scandal had continued unchecked, the consequences could have spread far beyond the marriage itself. Allies might have distanced themselves from the household. Rival families might have used the weakness to strengthen their own influence. Even the future inheritance of the children might have become uncertain. Within such a world, allowing chaos to continue would have been far more dangerous than the pain of silence. So, the wife acted with a purpose that few observers fully recognized. She restored discipline to the household. She guided the court away from gossip and back towards stability. She replaced scandal with symbols of unity and legitimacy. None of these actions required revenge. Revenge might have satisfied personal anger, but it would also have prolonged the crisis. Public humiliation, the dramatic accusations, or visible punishment might have entertained the court for a moment, yet they would have left lasting scars on the household's reputation. The wife chose a different path. Her strategy focused on survival. By removing the mistress without scandal, strengthening the legitimacy of the children, and rebuilding the public image of the marriage, she ensured that the household could continue functioning within the complex political landscape of the court. Time eventually confirmed the wisdom of that choice. The affair that once seemed capable of shaking the palace had faded into the background of memory. New political developments replaced it. New alliances formed. The daily rhythm of aristocratic life resumed its steady pace. What remained was the stability of the family itself. The court now saw the household not as the center of a scandal, but as a model of resilience. The wife's patience and discipline had prevented a private crisis from becoming a lasting political disaster. Her success revealed an important truth about power within royal societies. Authority often belongs not to those who create the most dramatic moments, but to those who preserve stability when drama threatens to destroy it. The wife had exercised exactly that form of authority. She had protected the future of the family. In doing so, she also protected the delicate balance that held the court together. Aristocratic politics depended on the reliability of noble households. Each family served as a pillar supporting the broader structure of alliances and governance. If those pillars weakened, the entire system could begin to tremble. By restoring order quietly and patiently, the wife reinforced that structure rather than allowing it to collapse. The court might never fully acknowledge how much depended on her restraint, but its behavior revealed the truth. Respect followed her presence. Allies trusted the stability of her household. The next generation of the family inherited a reputation stronger than the scandal that once threatened it. In the end, the story was never about jealousy. It was about survival. And survival in an aristocratic society often requires the ability to endure personal pain in order to protect something larger than oneself. The palace corridors that once carried whispers of scandal now held a different kind of silence. Not the tense silence of suspicion, but the calm quiet that follows when order returns after a storm. Tonight, as the lights of the great hall slowly dim and the court settles into its familiar rhythm once again. The story you have just heard fades gently into the background of history. What remains is the quiet lesson it leaves behind. Power does not always shout. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it endures. And sometimes the strongest victory is simply ensuring that the household continues standing long after the storm has passed. Thank you for spending this quiet journey through history together. Wherever you are listening from, perhaps late at night, perhaps in the calm moment before sleep, I hope this story has carried you gently through the shadows and lights of the past. Now the palace grows silent. The corridors are empty. The candles burn low, and the echoes of courtly intrigue slowly fade into the stillness of the night. Close your eyes. Let the noise of the day drift away, and allow the calm of this story to settle softly around you. Good night, and sleep well.